Hello, everybody. My name is Dryptosaurus, and welcome back to another Monster Hunter Wilds video. Today we are covering the flagship monster of the most recent Monster Hunter game, that being Arkveld. Or should I say flagship monsters? That's a mystery we will unravel very shortly. So, of course, as we do with all of our monsters, I like to give them a binomial name because we study them as though they are real animals, and so it's important to give them names as though they are real animals, scientific names with no overlap that keep them distinct from all the other species in the game. So for Arkveld, I've given it the name Nechigasha torvomastiga, which is a little bit excessive, but I think it captures what this animal looks like. Nechigasha comes from Amharic. It means white shield, and Torvomastiga is from Greek. It means the savage scourge, or the wild scourge. Torvo, meaning wild or savage, is in Torvosaurus, Torvonuestes, and Mastiga, meaning scourge, with the specific implication of someone who is deserving of whipping, which is, I think, very ironic, considering that Arkveld uses the chain whips. I kind of wanted to highlight that. And also, interesting fact, the root mastiga is also the same root for masticate, so it's the same root word that chewing comes from. For those of you unfamiliar, maybe this first time you're seeing my channel, the two components of Nechigasha torvomastiga are what we call a binomial name. They're made up of a genus, which is Nechigasha. That's a genus that would include multiple species, and then torvomastiga is the species. When you write them together, you're always going to write the species in lowercase. So it would be Nechigasha, or just N if you're abbreviating it, N, and then Torvomastiga in lowercase rather than both in uppercase here, but because they're separate and I'm going over the etymology of the words rather than writing out the name, then I uppercased both of them. One thing that's actually really important when you're naming a new species that I haven't covered in my previous videos because we haven't been able to have a discussion about it is the designation of a type specimen. When you name a new species, you have to pick an individual specimen that is going to carry that name. And this is something that is super important in natural history. These type specimens are so significant. When we say they're the name-bearing individual for a species, that's important because if a species gets split into 2 or 3 or 5, the only one that's going to keep the original name of that species is the type specimen. If a genus gets split in 2, then the type specimen for that genus is going to be the one that keeps the genus name. And so for Arkveld, we actually have a very unique opportunity to designate a type specimen, because there is one Arkveld individual that is the same for all players. It's no variation in size or morphology. It's quite different. It's quite unique. And we can name that Arkveld species, this Nechigasha torvomastiga, we can name it in association with the White Wraith, the guardian Arkveld that the story is based around, the one that attacks Nata and then you kill over the course of the low-ranked story. For an example of why type specimens are important, this type specimen on the right, this was discovered by William Buckland, is the reason why Dilophosaurus, the two-crested dude from Jurassic Park, is called Dilophosaurus weatherli rather than Megalosaurus weatherli. Dilophosaurus was initially classified as a species of Megalosaurus, which is a bad idea because they're not very closely related at all. And then those two species were split, and the only way that they could decide whether or not Dilophosaurus or Megalosaurus would keep that original name is because the type specimen for the genus Megalosaurus was clearly identified and everybody knew what it was. If there wasn't a clear type specimen, who knows what they would have both been called. So before we actually move on from this whole species conversation, because I promise it is particularly relevant to the Arkveld that we see in the game, we really need to talk about what a species is. Because we just named a species based off of Arkveld, specifically based off of the White Wraith in the main story. And without a clear definition of what a species is, it's going to be very difficult to tell if there is more than one species of Arkveld. Now, this might seem obvious because we obviously know Arkveld was around and then it went extinct, and then they brought it back as Guardian Arkveld, and then that Guardian Arkveld gave birth to an Arkveld, which is now the same as the original, right? It's not quite that simple at all, actually. Species are incredibly bizarre and difficult to define. And it's an important conversation to have, not necessarily because we want to nail down what a species is, period, because that's nearly impossible, but it's important to nail down what species concept we're using. We're going to go over a couple of them and then see how they apply to Monster Hunter, because the only thing that really, really matters here is being consistent with yourself. It's okay if your species concept, if you're writing up a paper, isn't necessarily the same as someone else's. You would probably get laughed out of a botany convention if you brought up a paper naming a new species based off of the species concept that's, used in like bacterial taxonomy or something like that. All these different fields of science have different species concepts that work best for them, and even among them, there's still dispute about which ones are the best. I recall there was actually some big debate a while ago about whether or not we should adopt an evolutionary or phylogenetic species concept for birds. And the reality is, if we chose to do that, the number of bird species would increase vastly. We would have many, many more birds, and that would upset a lot of people, particularly birders, because they would no longer have complete lists in a lot of these places. They wouldn't be able to say, well, I've seen all these species of birds in this place, because now there are more that they probably haven't reported on. Maybe they have seen them, and they just didn't write it down because one species is split into multiple. Anyway, this is all kind of a roundabout way of saying that a lot of the time, extinct species that seem to be present in the modern day, like we see with Arkveld, are not the same species at all by any functional definition. These two animals, Latimeria on the right, and I believe Mawsonia on the left, I'll have to double check, but it is an extinct species of coelacanth, are not the same species at all. Coelacanths are often referred to as living fossils because they're superficially very, very similar to some of their extinct relatives, but they're not actually that closely related to them, and so they get separated into separate species, even separate genera, which is very, very important to realize that when you're talking about a quote-unquote living fossil, a modern species that looks superficially similar to an extinct relative, you are not actually talking about the same species. And it's very important on where and how you draw that distinction. Here we have a far from exhaustive list of some species concepts that I think could maybe potentially apply to Arkveld. There are a lot of different species concepts that we could use, but reasonably a lot of them can't really be tested within Monster Hunter, primarily because it's a video game and we can't actually genetically sequence these animals or observe certain behaviors. I've never seen Arkveld do a mating ritual, for example. That might come up later. Arkveld's reproductive system is incredibly bizarre, and we will get to that towards the end of the slideshow. First, let's go over the morphological species concept. So this is the simplest one, and it's the one we use most often in things like paleontology, and it used to be used pretty well throughout biology until the concept of cryptic species started to come up. Morphological species concept is really the two organisms you're looking at, if they represent easily distinguishable physical characteristics that are diagnostic, that all members of each species has that, and no members of the other species have that, then you can call those two separate species. This is pretty much the case with Arkveld, in that all the Arkveld that we know of share the same physical characteristics, kind of. They look the same from the outside. Morphologically, they are quite similar. Then again, there is the issue of the whole guardian system. Are guardian monsters separate species? Maybe. So I say yes here, but I think it's more of a tentative yes. The reproductive recognition concept, the recognition species concept, is the idea that two organisms are the same species if they recognize each other as viable mates. This is, of course, untestable within Monster Hunter because Arkveld mating behavior is unobservable. The phylogenetic species concept represents the smallest number of populations or lineages that you can diagnose with a unique combination of traits. Now, these traits don't necessarily have to be physical traits. They can be genetic traits. And this is how we get into identifying things like cryptic species. For example, the American crocodile morphologically is one species. Pretty much all the American crocodiles around the world look the same. But there are several species of American crocodiles that are genetically and environmentally distinct predict, and they are quite different. Some of them have close genetic relatives that are not American crocodiles, for example. So the American crocodiles that live in Cuba are actually more closely related to Cuban crocodiles, genetically speaking, than they are to the mainland American crocodile. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they share an evolutionary history with that Cuban crocodile, that they're actually not really American crocodiles. It just means that they are different in a few identifiable ways, and because there's a small population that shares all those traits, they are considered to be a separate species. This would split Arkveld into multiple species for reasons that I will get into. The evolutionary species concept is the idea that if we can identify two separate, independently evolving lineages that are not interacting and they're going to evolve, then that represents two different species. This one is hard. It involves a lot of math and population surveying to make compelling arguments for. And it also relies kind of on the prediction of the future. Evolution is difficult to predict, and if you're trying to separate two lineages as they're diverging rather than looking at two already diverged lineages, I personally don't think it's worthwhile to really apply this species concept in a lot of areas. I think it does have its utilities, all of these do. However, with Arkveld, we can also use the evolutionary species concept to pretty cleanly break it into multiple species as well. So Arkveld is not one species under either the phylogenetic or the evolutionary species concept. In the biological species concept, it's quite simple. If the two organisms can interbreed and produce offspring, or fertile offspring typically, it's one species. And the biological species concept has kind of come under a lot of fire because really this is not what defines a species in most cases. Animals are very, very frivolous in terms of what they mate with. Particularly, a lot of them tend to create fertile hybrids. Under the biological species concept, many species of crocodilians would be lumped together because they can create fertile hybrid offspring. The same thing with sturgeons and paddlefish. I don't know if their offspring are fertile, but certainly it calls into question the validity of this species concept when two taxa that are separated by about 100 million years of evolution are still considered to be the same species. They're certainly related to each other, but everything on the planet is related to every other thing to some degree. So the biological species concept, while it has its utility, is not particularly applicable to a lot of forms of life. And so it's kind of fallen out of favor in a lot of circles just because of how messy it is and how you separate the different kinds of reproductive barriers. Fortunately, I don't have to work out whether or not the biological species concept considers Arkveld to be one species, because it's impossible to test if two Arkveld can breed and have offspring in the game. And as we get into later, they might not actually be able to. Arkveld has a very, very weird reproductive lifestyle, and so there's a lot to cover here. The biological species concept might even be applicable depending on how you look at it. But for now, it's considered impossible to test. So one thing that I wanted to kind of nip in the bud here is the misconception that species must always form by splitting. When a lot of people conceive of the tree of life and the history of a given species, they think about an ancestral population that comes down like this and then splits, and then one side gets isolated or both sides get isolated, and now you have two species down the line. This isn't necessarily always the case. Sometimes one species emerges from another without any sort of splitting of the population, and you get what's called a chronospecies. This process is called anagenesis rather than cladogenesis, which is the splitting process. And this is really well documented in a species of dinosaur called Triceratops horridus. It is an anagenetic species that arose out of Triceratops prorsus. So you had these two different species of Triceratops that were both being found in the same vague area, but one of them was much older than the other. And so what was worked out eventually by a lot of really great paleontologists is that there wasn't necessarily two species of Triceratops living together. There used to be, the idea that there were loads and loads of different species of Triceratops, and they all looked slightly different. Rather, there was kind of a gradient going between one of these Triceratops species and another, and so that was producing a whole bunch of intermediate morphologies until the second species could be very, very clearly identified. And indeed, if you look at these animals, it's pretty different. It's quite distinct. Their horns curve in different ways. The jaw, the rostrum of Triceratops prorsus is much longer. That nose horn is long and flat. It goes right out to the front. front. Triceratops horridus doesn't actually have a very pronounced nose horn. And it's all well and good to identify these separate specimens as different species, but when you have a gradient between them, it becomes much harder to draw that line. So we can't discount the possibility that Arkveld is, in fact, a chronospecies. And that some kind of anagenesis has occurred in its evolutionary history, which means that we're not going to be drawing necessarily a tree that's splitting into 4 species or multiple species, something like this, but rather that it might just be a progression from the ancestral population of Arkveld up till the modern one with, clearly defined stepping points where we can identify different morphologies if Arkveld is indeed multiple species. So is Arkveld one species? No, I really do not think so. Mainly because when we look at the way that Arkveld is defined and what sets it apart from other monsters, we notice one thing in particular, and it's that you can't really break out Guardian Arkveld, which is very, very distinct to both the Arkveld that we have in the game today and the ancestor of Guardian Arkveld. When you basically create this clone lineage, and that clone lineage has unique descendants, you have split your original population into multiple different species. So here I have basically at least 4 defined species of Arkveld. We have our ancestral population that may or may not be a separate species to this guy, the ancestral or the wild population that coexisted with Guardian Arkveld and then went extinct. And then you have your Guardian Arkveld up here, which is pretty clearly different from the original population, physiologically, morphologically, presumably genetically very different. It develops in a very different way. It has a completely different lifestyle. And then you have your modern Arkveld that descended from the clone lineage. And the way that this works is basically when we define a species, if we want it to be a true clade, a clade is a branch of the tree of life that you can remove with only one cut. This is a little bit hard to visualize, but if you imagine, for example, birds as a clade. Birds are a clade. You can have a tree of dinosaurs. There's all these different dinosaurs and all these branches coming off. And then you have this blue branch, which is birds. Actually, it's going to be a network of branches. You're going to have it over here. And I'm going to say this blue branch is birds. I can cut it right at the stem here, and then I will have a tree of life without birds, and that I have removed with only one slice. Now, if I want to try and include something else over here in this bird clade, I can't. I have to make multiple cuts to unite all of the blue things as one species. And we want to really avoid that because we want our names, our species, to represent true evolutionary lineages, which is why I think the only thing that you can really do here is split Arkveld into 3 or 4 separate species if you want to effectively talk about it. That would require a precedent, though, and we would have to look at somewhere in the real world where something similar has happened. So let's do that. Let's look at silk moths. Silk moths make a pretty interesting comparison to Arkveld because specifically the 2 species that we're going to be looking at today. So there's 2 species of silk moths that are of note here. We have Bombyx mori and Bombyx mandarina. So one of these species, Bombyx mori, is a domesticated version of Bombyx mandarina. It's significantly different. Its reproductive ability is completely hampered. It really cannot survive without human support. They can't fly. They have a very, very hard time getting out of their cocoons on their own. They need human assistance throughout their entire life. They've also lost their color. So there's a lot of physiological change that has happened here as the result of the domestication process. However, the Bombyx mandarina species is wild. It's still a living functional organism, doesn't need any human assistance beyond, I'm sure, keeping its habitat around and making sure that its associated species don't go extinct. But all things considered, Bombyx mandarina is doing relatively well. The question here is whether or not we consider guardian species to be separate species from their base monsters. And because of the split between Bombyx mori and Bombyx mandarina, I argue yes. Guardian species are effectively like domesticated silk moths in that their physiology is very, very different from the wild population, even as it continues to exist. What they've done is basically the same thing that created the species Bombyx mori, where they take a small wild population, they modify it in some way. We don't know exactly how the Wyverians created these guardians, but they take that wild population, they modify it in some way. We know there's a specific selective process because they had to actually pick out the guardian monsters. They're not just spat out of the cocoons randomly. They make some change, whether it be physiological or they're actually going in and modifying the genetics. But the reality is the guardian monsters are different, and different genes are being expressed within them. They are reproductively isolated from their base species. They can't reproduce without human assistance, especially, mainly because their reproductive systems are completely atrophied. So they are genetically isolated from their ancestor population. Ordinarily, we don't really have to have this conversation because guardian monsters are not a functional species. They're effectively, defective individuals of the base species. But with guardian Arkveld, it has all these traits that separate guardians from their base species, and it's reproductively viable because we see it produce eggs. Because of that, I really can't see any reason to classify guardian Arkveld as the same as this ancestral Arkveld population. It's morphologically distinct. It looks very, very different. It's called different things by the hunters. Wild's Arkveld is not stated to be able to absorb elements on its own. We talked to Alma about the records of Arkveld. She says there's no precedent for Arkveld being able to do that. There is no gene flow between Arkveld's guardian species and the ancestral Arkveld population because at this point they're all extinct. So we have no genetic exchange. We have something that's physiologically separate and something that's clearly evolving in a new direction. It is also easily separated from its ancestors by a unique combination of traits. It can manipulate the elements, it can produce the Wilk explosions, it can feed on Wilk, and it glows white. It's magic. It's a magic-looking animal compared to the ancestral Arkveld population, which presumably looks more similar to our normal Arkvelds that we see in wilds. So yes, I would argue that guardian species should be considered a separate species from their base monster if they can breed on their own, if they're reproductively isolated. I have a harder time making that distinction for things like guardian Fulgurangnath or guardian Eboniodogaron, mainly because they're not really reproductively viable. They're not functional species that are actually out there, roaming around. They just kind of get spat out of the pods repeatedly. But the guardian Arkveld is a completely separate story, which is again why I'm making this distinction. And now, here we have kind of an interesting dilemma, because if this guy, our modern species, is Arkveld, and this ancient extinct species is also Arkveld, but these two aren't the same species because they're separated by a guardian Arkveld that is very much a distinct species from these two populations. These guys you could maybe conceivably call one species, but that's also iffy. Then which one is Nechigasha torvomastiga? And what do we call the others? Well, fortunately, we already previously designated a type specimen, so we don't have the issue of trying to figure out which population we designate Nechigasha torvomastiga, that original species. One thing that is interesting, though, is trying to sort out this whole situation on the bottom left. I'm really unsure if we're meant to split this into, 3 or 4 species. The conservative thing to do is, I think, to leave it as 3 because we really can't demonstrate that the extinct descendant Arkveld population is different from the original. They could have evolved differently. Animals tend to, just change over time, especially when there's a split like this. They tend to just, passively change from their ancestors. If you took a human from today and compared it to a human, 10,000, 100,000 years ago, they would look, not 10,000, definitely more like 100,000 years ago, they would look substantially physically different. And that's not necessarily saying that they're separate species, but there are different phenotypes present, and given enough time, two species will be differentiated, just like Triceratops horridus and Triceratops prorsus. Now let's go through our updated nomenclature here. So our type specimen is going to be guardian Arkveld. That is Nechigasha torvomastiga. Now we're going to lump these guys all into one genus. Whether or not you want to call it one genus is actually kind of subjective. Genera are not necessarily as rigid as species are, and species are not rigid at all. So a lot of these terms that we use to group these animals are pretty plastic. They're really terms of utility, not necessarily terms of perfect definitions of what nature is like. We give things names so we can know what they are and talk about them, not necessarily because we think our models perfectly represent exactly what is and is not a species, because with evolution in mind, there's really no such thing as a distinct species. Everything is all related to something else, and there is always a little bit of play between two close relatives. Anyway, our two guys on the bottom here are going to be our new species, which is Nechigasha eoflagellum. That means first whip. because they are the original ancestral population of Arkveld. And so if they are indeed the same species, if they're not separated out, then these guys represent our ancestral population that is somewhat different from our modern population, which is going to be called Torvomastiga alba, or Nechigasha torvomastiga alba. It's a subspecies of the clone lineage. Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to roll with that. It's going to be, we're going to portmanteau clone lineage to clineage. So our modern species is a subspecies of the clone lineage, of the clineage, which, you could separate it out into its own species, like with Triceratops. It is quite different, but I'm just going off of the precedent that was established with the silk moths earlier. Bombyx mori is a subspecies of its ancestral population rather than a fully established separate species. I mean, they are clearly evolving in different directions. They have a pretty well understood evolutionary history. They're absolutely not genetically interchanging, but because that speciation happened relatively recently, and because it sits within this ancestral population genetically, the argument was made to classify them as a subspecies rather than a full distinct species. There's really not that much that's different, but we're going to follow that trend. We have another dilemma, and here I have included an image of a crying scientist that I found on a stock image website, which you can get great results for, by the way, if you search sad scientist stock image. I was having quite a chuckle. But this scientist is sad for a very important reason, and it's that we can't really name this ancestral Arkveld species if we have no physical records of it. We don't know of any fossils that the guild has dug up that represent it. We don't know if there are any actual specimens preserved. We just have writing about it that Alma has briefly mentioned. So how can we actually name the species if we have no physical records? Well, that issue, fortunately, has somewhat of a solution. This is what happens when you have to designate a lectotype. So presumably, the guild had some contact with Arkveld, and they wrote some stuff down about it, the original populations, because Alma quotes it to us. However, there are no apparent physical specimens available for that species. So we can't actually designate a physical holotype until there is a wild original population Arkveld that is found alive, maybe in the DLC, who knows, maybe we'll be able to buck this issue, or a wild Arkveld has its remains uncovered and it's definitively established to be from that ancestral population. And we could use those bones as a holotype. Until then, any sort of research illustration of the original population or some notes or stuff like that, we would call that an iconotype, and we would use that to designate the species. Now that seems a little bizarre, doesn't it? It seems, like it's a little bit substandard, and it is, because that's something you really only do if there's no physical specimens available, but if it's detailed enough, it can be used to recognize a new species, and we have some interesting examples of this. So here we have two species that are known from iconotypes. The type specimen is an illustration or a photograph. On the left, you have a Burmese python, which we'll talk about a little bit later, actually, which is a big snake that is primarily found in Southeast Asia. Very popular pet, but it was originally described from a drawing. And then on the right, we have Tamaryraptor, which is a big meat-eating dinosaur from North Africa that has no physical remains preserved right now. They were collected by a paleontologist named Ernst Stromer, and then in the 1940s, they were obliterated. They were bombed, but they were displayed in a museum before that, and a photo was taken of them, and folks used this photo to realize that this animal had distinct traits about its bones that were visible in the photo that separated it from all other North African Carcharodontosaurid dinosaurs. And so we knew it was a unique meat eater that looked a little bit different than all of its close relatives. Now, do I think this is necessarily an optimal choice? No, but it was the only choice available. It's between either saying we have no way to tell what this thing is, or we have a way to distinguish this animal, known only from photographs or paintings or drawings or writings, from everything else, and we can do that for sure. So we're going to designate this iconotype so that folks who find more of it in the future will actually have a chance to realize that we're talking about the same thing. And so the same would happen, hopefully, with Arkveld in those original research notes that Alma is referring to. Now that I've ranted at you about species concepts and nomenclature and all these ideas for approximately now 29 minutes, why does this matter? Why the heck am I even talking about this? Well, this has a couple answers. The first one is that species concepts are an important discussion to have when we're talking about real life animals, and this series is meant to basically treat these animals as though they do truly exist, as opposed to, just kind of going through what the game says about them. And in real life, species concepts are incredibly important for conservation. Species that don't get properly described or named have a much more difficult time receiving protection, not only because people don't care about them, but also because oftentimes if they're not properly named or described, we don't know where they are, we don't know what they're like, we just don't know how to properly study them until we know what the heck we're dealing with. Additionally, if that species is never named and described and it's a cryptic species, like for example those Cuban American crocodiles, not to be confused with Cuban crocodiles, if those Cuban American crocodiles all went extinct, we would lose a species without even knowing about it if they weren't described as being a separate species. So this is something that is very, very important in real life. And that kind of extinction without recognition of the original species is just what happened with Arkveld. If the guild knew about Guardian Arkveld but didn't classify it as a separate species and considered it, suitable for conservation, and they were like, well, it doesn't really matter if these Arkvelds are dying out because we already have, a robust population of clones and all these guys. If they elected to allow the original population to die out without properly understanding that they were dealing with multiple different species, this is just a hypothetical. I know this is not actually how it went, but if that was the case, then that would be a direct consequence of improperly classifying this animal that resulted in the complete annihilation of one species, which is terrible. That's not something that should happen unless there's a very, very good reason for it, and there seldom is. So this is why talking about nomenclature and species concepts and all that stuff is important, because it is the baseline and it's the bedrock for the more important conversations, not more important, but the more interesting conversations that we have in biology and evolution and conservation and all that. So now, let's actually talk about Arkveld. Let's talk about what it is ecologically, where it might have come from, its evolution, its life, all that. The first thing that I want to talk about is its teeth. One thing you might notice about Arkveld's teeth is that they're actually relatively small, and its mouth is not that big. In fact, it kind of has a hard time eating because its rostrum is very short, its antlers are very big, or its horns are very big. They don't seem to shed, so they're not antlers. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But Arkveld is not an animal that is killing with its mouth, even though it is a voracious predator. It seems to be primarily doing its killing with other parts of its body. And because of that, its teeth are not really well adapted for killing, but they are relatively well adapted for food processing. Its teeth aren't as specialized as some of the stuff that we see in the other monsters. They're relatively homodont, which means that they're all fairly similar to one another. There's not a great amount of differentiation in size and shape. There is a pretty big differentiation in size, but in general, the teeth all have the same sort of architecture. We can expect a little bit of variation in different parts of the mouth. And, it's not necessarily the case that there are clean differentiations of different tooth types, but even so, we can expect a slight amount of heterodonty in just about every animal because different parts of the mouth are doing different tasks. So there is just a general trend of kind of shorter, broader teeth in the back of the mouth and, slicey ones in the front and big gripping canines on the side, even if they are all the same quote-unquote kind of tooth. But for example, if you looked at something like a mammal, they're really, really clearly defined canines and incisors and molars and premolars and all that stuff. Arkveld doesn't have that. Its teeth are all basically just ice cream cone shaped. One thing that is really interesting about Arkveld's teeth that you can see here, they are all relatively similar in size and shape. There's a nice kind of transition there. They're not clearly separated out into groups. They don't have very large occlusal surfaces. The teeth are not, sliding over one another, which is, not very good if Arkveld would be trying to crush something with its teeth. Instead, these teeth are sliding past each other, and they're relatively conical. This is a morphology that we see in animals that are really, really concerned about gripping and keeping stuff inside their mouth. This is called interdigitation, and we see this in Spinosaurus. This is fairly common in large predators, and it's interesting that Arkveld has this kind of dentition. It might just be a holdover from a previous life, or it might be that it's focusing on gripping small chunks of meat as it pulls them out of a prey animal, because its mouth is certainly not very well adapted for hunting. It has all this ornamentation on its face that is important, but it's kind of preventing it from being an effective biter and grabber. And Arkveld in the game indeed does primarily hunt with its arms and its feet, and in many cases it does doesn't even really need to eat at all to get a lot of energy because of that whole elemental absorption thing. But presumably the ancestors of Arkveld that didn't yet have that ability would not have been using their mouth as their primary weapon. Even so, we can go over the different kinds of teeth in the mouth of Arkveld. First up, we have these little premaxillary teeth, and these are quite similar to what we see in things like crocodilians and dinosaurs, where they'll be much smaller than the teeth on the sides of the mouth. And in Arkveld, it's actually quite interesting that they're kind of packed together and they slide right over one another as opposed to interdigitating like the teeth in the back of the mouth. And that makes a lot of sense because the premaxillary teeth, as well as the front teeth of the dentary, which is the bone on the lower jaw. So this is all the dentary bone here, which is the tooth-bearing bone on the lower jaw. And then on the upper jaw, it's going to be split into usually about 2 bones in big vertebrates like this, where you'll have a premaxilla up here, and that premaxilla will attach to the nose bone up there, that's the nasal, and so on and so on. But this is the maxilla, this big bone back here, and the premaxilla is going to bear the first few teeth. Arkveld's premaxillary teeth are all bunched up together. They're smaller, they seem to be sharper, and they effectively form this kind of scissor action with its front dentary teeth. So they're acting just like our incisors. So like I said, these teeth will have a shearing action. So when you have this motion past one tooth past the other with no occlusion, it's going to result in a really effective shearing action, as opposed to something like this on the right, where the teeth are sliding into each other and you get some grinding action, but it's going to be less effective to tear and cut. That's very important, for example, if you're chewing on, I don't know, if you're trying to crush a bone, or if you're chewing up some tough plant matter that you need to keep processing and processing. But as a big carnivore, Arkveld really doesn't have to do that much. It really just has to tear through a chunk of meat, pull it into the back of its mouth, and grab onto it while it maybe wriggles around if the animal's still alive as it's being eaten. Or it can just grab that chunk of meat and grip it with its back teeth and then throw it into the back of its mouth. Really, this kind of shearing, sliding action is important for tearing small, soft bits off of a piece of food. We see this in meat eaters. We also see this in frugivores, fruit-eating animals. Anything. Hey, sorry for that noise at the end of the last slide. That was my roommate calling me away from my recording because the Monster Hunter Ascendance trailer just played on the Summer Games Fest. Oh my God. Wow, that's something. I'm incredibly excited for the DLC. I'll probably talk about it more at the end of this video when I've actually processed it. But now I just have to pretend like nothing happened and go back to recording this video, which I'm going to do my best to do. But I'm very, very excited about the fact that, we have wyverns with jet engines in their wings, which looks pretty cool. It's kind of like Monster Hunter Tears of the Kingdom. Anyway, so the 2 kinds of teeth that we're looking at here are the maxillary and dentary caniniform teeth. I'm using the term caniniform rather than canine because these aren't clearly differentiated from the other teeth again. Their shape is still kind of the same, but they function as canines. They're large, they're pointed, and they're going to do better at gripping than they are at shearing, which you can see because they're kind of interdigitating. They're sliding across one another. And we see this sort of thing in loads of animals where they are kind of partially modifying their teeth to act as canines, even though they're not so different from the other teeth that they have. A really interesting thing about these caniniform teeth is that when these large and sharp teeth slide past each other, they also create this kind of cleaving action that allows for both very, very deep puncture wounds and also tearing of tissue. For example, we can look at my favorite prehistoric animal of all time, Barudaroi, which is a species of extinct crocodile, or actually not extinct crocodile. I will flagellate myself for that. It's an extinct crocodilian, specifically it's a mechasuchine. It is not a crocodile. Anyway, its teeth are similar in that they're very, very optimized for this kind of tearing rather than the bite and hold feeding strategy of most crocodilians. And you can see they have this giant lower caniniform that slides past these upper caniniform teeth to create that kind of cleaving, tearing action that allows for very deep puncturing. Why Arkveld has this in particular, maybe it's just an adaptation for feeding, maybe it's a holdover of an earlier Arkveld ancestor that may have been feeding using its mouth primarily and specialized its teeth. Those are both possibilities. It might be both. Mutations and features don't necessarily disappear when they stop being super, super useful. They only really disappear when they start being detrimental in a major way. If you look at things like whales, a lot of early whales held on to their pelvic bones their leg bones for a very, very long time, way after they could no longer breed on land. So the use and exaptation of old mutations for different purposes is interesting. And these canines or caniniform teeth, while they might have been used in Arkveld and its ancestors for tearing through live prey, maybe now they're just used to tear through meat that it's already eaten. If you're in towards the back of the mouth, we get more of these interdigitating teeth. Again, these are going to help a lot with gripping. They look quite similar to the front teeth, but the actual pattern of their occlusion is different, which is why I'm talking about them as though they're separate. Another really interesting thing to note with Arkveld is that it doesn't have lips. These teeth are just kind of out in the air, which is unique in that that's usually not something that you want if you're an animal. You lose a lot of moisture through your mouth if your teeth are not sealed. And so perhaps Arkveld, like a crocodilian, has a very heavily keratinized mouth on the inside, something like Lagiacris, for example. Or maybe it's like a bird. Who knows? But there should be an adaptation somewhere within Arkveld that would prevent it from the usual downsides of just having its teeth hanging out in the air. Additionally, exposed teeth will accrue much more damage over the course of its life. So the adaptation to kind of just expose its teeth like this is very, very interesting and a little bit puzzling to me. Onto the actual function of all these teeth together. When these teeth interlock in this way, they are really, really good at holding on to struggling prey or just some slippery food. Arkveld's teeth are actually very, very similar to those of giant pliosaurs, which are extinct marine reptiles that are somewhat closely related to turtles. By kind of looking at pliosaurs as a relatively loose model, we can start to understand how Arkveld might be using its mouth and what all these different teeth are for. So, unlike Arkveld, pliosaurs have really, really long skulls. They're not super well, quote-unquote, optimized for biting with a lot of force. In particular, pliosaurs have these long skulls because long, thin skulls are really, really good at getting around water resistance. Arkveld does not live underwater, so it can have this very, very tall, very robust, brutish skull that is much, much better at applying that force compared to a pliosaur. Of course, this will make it harder for it to reach prey because it has horns in the way, but in terms of actually exerting force on the stuff in its mouth, Arkveld's skull is pretty good. And so it seems to be kind of an optimized version of this pliosaur dental formula where it has some teeth that interlock, some that slide past each other. And it's very, very good at grabbing stuff that's difficult to grab. However, interestingly, again, I'm very puzzled as to why it would have all these adaptations if its mouth is really just not that well positioned for killing. Using the hands and feet primarily for that, you would expect the mouth to maybe be a little bit more gracile. The head is indeed very small, but Arkveld is a really, really interesting animal anatomically. So this actually touches on an interesting trend or kind of morphology that we see in a lot of different animals called anisodonty. Anisodonty is kind of a condition where there is a really big amount of size variation among teeth in the mouth, but there's actually not a lot of change in shape between the teeth. Now, these animals can be functionally heterodont in that they have different parts of their mouth with different size teeth that are specialized for different things, but the teeth themselves are not that different in structure. What's interesting about these anisodont animals is that they eventually gave rise to heterodont descendants. Not necessarily all the time, but it has happened throughout the fossil record, and if Arkveld continues to use its teeth in unique ways, it would make sense that its teeth would maybe specialize over time for different kinds of food processing. If it maybe had to crush things, it could start to flatten the teeth in the rear of its mouth, or stuff like that. So I think this is just an interesting thing to bring up because it's a term that fits Arkveld very, very well, and it includes some interesting evolutionary trends that we might see in Arkveld's descendants. Another really interesting thing that I mentioned earlier is that Arkveld has very, very, very reduced extraoral tissue, that is, tissue around the mouth, lips, and associated stuff. Sadly, as I mentioned, there's just not a ton of research into the actual function of the reduction of extraoral tissue, why we see it in certain groups of animals. There's just not a ton of existing research about it beyond trying to figure out, which animals in the fossil record did or did not have it based on their ecology, based on their lifestyle, based on the kind of structures we find around their mouth. One really, really great researcher who's done a lot of work on this, and by a lot I mean papers and some blog posts, but that's kind of really all there is academically about paleontologically examining which reptiles had lips. You can read him. Mark Whitten is his name. He wrote a book called Pterosaurs. It's one of the best textbooks about prehistoric life ever. I wholeheartedly recommend it. He's also a pretty great guy. I have had some lovely conversations with him, and I definitely recommend that you check out his work, not just here on this specific topic, but also because he's a pretty solid science communicator in a lot of other areas. And if you're interested in reading about science, go check out Mark Whitten's blog, which is where these images are from. Another kind of interesting facial tissue that Arkveld has is very, very hard facial tissue, pivoting away from the absence of lips. We get to the presence of these big osteoderms, these big feature scales that are covering the face. Arkveld is incredibly well armored, which is not something that we often see on carnivorous animals. Usually predators are adapted to be light and fast so they can catch their prey, and they try to put minimal effort into self-protection. Facial armor in general is usually very, very rare in animals that are, concerned with moving fast. But that's not something that you would expect from a pursuit predator. However, this does make sense because we see a lot more investment in facial tissue that is hard and armored, and just in general facial protection by having very robust, very well protected skulls and armor across the body in predators that are not so fast moving. These guys, while they are warm-blooded in a couple cases, are relatively slow. They're four-legged. They're maybe ambush predators. These are some Pseudotsuchians from a whole bunch of different time periods. Up here we have Tukinsuchus, which is a really, really interesting Pseudotsuchian as well. A lot of these guys, they would have been able to run, but they're no cheetahs. They have, if you look at the guy in the bottom, that's Tukinsuchus, relatively short legs. Probably not a particularly fast animal, certainly faster than its prey, but in terms of its body structure, you can see it's also put a substantial amount of effort into protecting itself, which is not something that we would expect to see from predators. So why would Arkveld also be investing in this kind of body armor? This is the slide that I meant to flip to, but why would Arkveld develop body armor? And I have here an image of a cheetah with a turtle shell on its back, because I think that's effectively what's happening here. So our first hypothesis for why Arkveld would develop this kind of protection is that it's not necessarily an apex predator. Food systems, ecosystems, and their food webs change substantially over time, especially after extinction events. And so you might see predators and prey animals with very, very bizarre adaptations immediately following an extinction event because they're radiating into all these new niches. They're basically exploiting recently opened territory, and it makes sense because we do think that the world of Monster Hunter relatively recently underwent some massive ecological change for various reasons. On the right, you can see a chart that shows how, as the number of prey species that are available within an ecosystem over time decreases, the actual structure of the food web becomes substantially less interconnected. This was particularly an example from Quaternary Spain, where you used to have an ecosystem that was dominated by very, very diverse, relatively medium to small-sized grazing animals that were then usurped by a few species of very large grazers, and that vastly reduced the available number of niches and the kind of interconnectedness of the food web, and it reduced predatory diversity. Basically, this is kind of showing how predators are really subject to their ecosystems rather than this idea that they're kind of the rulers of an ecosystem that they sit in. Predators are exceptionally important, yes, and they do have a big impact on their ecosystem, but they're also incredibly vulnerable to extinction, especially the higher up the food chain you go, because predators that eat loads and loads of different stuff rely on all that different stuff to sustain themselves. And so when those predators go extinct, their prey items tend to diversify. Another interesting example of this is something called the Lilliput effect, where after mass extinctions, both across species and within species, smaller body sizes seem to be very, very heavily selected for. So if Arkveld did survive the last major mass extinction, it's hard to say how old the guild is. If they were keeping records of Arkveld before the end of the last mass extinction and then it died in that and humans somehow made it through, regardless, it was probably not the biggest predatory animal in that pre-extinction ecosystem if it actually made it over that boundary, because not only would we see smaller individuals of Arkveld species be more successful through that extinction, we would also just see smaller species in general be much more successful because it takes a lot less calories to run a much smaller body. Mass extinctions are very, very good at reducing the number of available resources for a given species or a given individual, and so it makes quite a lot of sense that being teeny tiny is a really, really good way to stay resilient and make it through a mass extinction. If you're a T-Rex and you can't kill any Triceratops, because those Triceratops can't find enough food to sustain themselves because all the plants are dying, you're going to have a really, really terrible time. However, if you're a little tiny neo-avian and you're flapping around all pleasant-like, and you're not having much of a hard time at all finding food because you just need a teeny tiny bit of food to carry you through the day, as opposed to the Triceratops that needs to eat like basically a ton of plant matter, it's going to be a lot easier for you to survive. And so one of you is going to make it over that boundary, over that catastrophic event, and the other one isn't. So Arkveld is probably, in terms of pre-Great Extinction monsters, on the relatively small side, which I think is very, very interesting. Might seem a little bit ridiculous to say because Arkveld is a big animal, but in the world of Monster Hunter, Arkveld is actually relatively diminutive compared to some of the biggest animals that we have. They aren't necessarily common. There's certainly not a lot of stuff bigger than Arkveld, but there are certainly things that are much, much bigger than Arkveld. And if certain ecosystems can sustain these animals today, it's pretty doubtless that in the recent past, which probably harbored similar biodiversity between extinction events, there were also giant monsters of that size. Maybe they weren't just as big, but throughout Earth's history, we've had stuff in the oceans that is approaching the size bracket of stuff like blue whales. So if we look at a potential ecosystem that Arkveld might have inhabited, here these guys are just here for size reference, but you can see that the animals which survive this extinction event are much, much smaller than the largest predatory organisms in the ecosystem. Personally, I doubt that Arkveld's armor is just some evolutionary holdover, particularly because I think it's something that could be quite effective today. Otherwise, you would expect to see it reduced quite heavily generation after generation because that armor is going to weigh you down. Something that I think is often not really covered in discussions of the purpose of certain traits and ecologies is growth dynamics. Animals don't spend their lives as adults. Many of them spend most of their lives under their maximum adult size, and their growth patterns are incredibly varied. There are some animals that will basically never reach their adult size until the day that they die, and then they hit their maximum size of their life. They just keep growing forever. And there are some animals that skyrocket very, very quickly to a near adult size, and they just kind of plateau. By figuring out which one of these growth strategies Arkveld uses, we can figure out if this armor is actually a very, very beneficial strategy. Just for an example to show the kind of difference that we see in growth strategies, these are all ecosystems that are representing the Pleistocene. So these are showing kind of the size classes of available individuals. On the smaller side, you have the left side of the graph, so you can see the upper Shadron Formation is dominated by relatively small-bodied animals, and then that's not the Shadron Formation. That is the one above the Shadron Formation, but it's true also. This is the Shadron Formation. And then on the Rancho La Brea Formation, which is where the La Brea tar pits are, you have also an ecosystem that is fairly dominated by relatively small animals, but you got some big folks in there towards the top. That's your Columbian mammoths. And then if we switch, these guys, keep in mind, these are all mammal-dominated ecosystems. Reptiles are not nearly as biodiverse in these ecosystems as they were a few million years prior. So if we switch and we take a look at reptile-dominated ecosystems, reptile growth strategies, regardless of whether they're warm or cold-blooded, are very, very different than mammal growth strategies. And we can see that these reptile growth strategies are producing very, very different kind of structures in the population. You can see these graphs are a lot more flat. There is a much larger proportion of large individuals, indeed, because these animals do hit larger body sizes, but you also have, kind of this gradation. And a lot of the animals that are hitting those smaller body sizes and occupying those smaller niches are juveniles. When we find dinosaurs, most of the time they're subadults. And this is because the way that reptiles grow, particularly the way that dinosaurs grow, even though they do grow relatively quickly, they tend to not hit their maximum size until very, very late in their life compared to mammals that do it quite quickly. These are different growth strategies with different purposes and different benefits, but it really is important to consider because for one of these animals, developing armor that protects it as a juvenile but doesn't do much for it as an adult is a very, very good idea because it's going to take a longer time to grow and it's going to spend a larger portion of its life protected by that armor. And the other one is a terrible idea because the very short portion of its life, where it's smaller than it would be as an adult, is going to be spent under the protection of its parents. So, for example, if an elephant developed a trait that only protected it when it was very, very young, and it was, maybe let's say a quarter of its adult size, it would be pretty useless. Yes, there are baby elephants that get preyed on, but for the most part, they're protected by their parents. For a lizard that is going to spend most of its life away from its parents even when it is growing and developing armor that protects it when it's small from threats that it doesn't face as an adult is a very, very good idea. So I've prepared here a graph just illustrating, or a pair of graphs rather, illustrating why I think this change in size over time and the rate at which it happens is so relevant. So in the green box is the area where I've kind of roughly determined that the armor would be very beneficial when the animal is less than half its maximum size. You can see these elephants on the left, which are mammals, so they're growing quite quickly, and they're growing very, very rapidly in the beginning of their life, are going to make use of this armor for a relatively small duration of their overall lifespan. Whereas on the right, you have some crocodilians, and these crocodilians, specifically Nile crocodiles from Wangea National Park, there's a few individuals, and you can see that they take almost 25 years to attain their half of their maximum body size, and they just keep going. So if Arkveld does in fact grow like a crocodile rather than something like a bird or an elephant, that armor would be extraordinarily beneficial early in its life and for an extended period of time, because whereas a adult Arkveld would obviously not have to worry about most of the predators in its environment, a younger Arkveld might have a hard time dealing with something like a Rathalos or even a Yankutku. These animals are relatively large, especially in comparison to what we know of the egg that Arkveld has. So unfortunately, we can't actually observe Arkveld. We can't weigh it every year and figure out how fast it grows. So we have to look at other areas to kind of gather clues about its life history. And here I'm going to present a case that argues that Arkveld grows relatively quickly and it front loads its growth early in its life. And this comes with a caveat that obviously you can't measure this. And many of these things are measured from animal groups. Well, all of these things are measured from animal groups that are not wyverns. We don't know if these trends that hold true across many groups of animals also apply to wyverns in Monster Hunter, which is something that I want to stress. When you're applying real-world science to a game like this, there are some caveats and limitations. And the limitation here is that I'm assuming wyverns, relatively speaking, work the same as real-world animals. So this is not official game lore that I'm discussing. If you're having an argument about somebody about whether or not Arkveld grows quickly, don't cite this video as evidence that the game says that way. This is just kind of drawing conclusions from similar animals in the real world. The first one is the egg. Arkveld has a very, very big egg. Most of the way through the story of Low Rank, for those of you unaware, maybe you haven't played the game all the way through, so spoilers, but most of the way through the story, Guardian Arkveld regains its previous abilities, or at least has found out to have regained its previous abilities. Guardians are all sterile. They're sterile monsters. And at the end of that main story, when Nada has not yet aged, he's, I think, using the same character model at least, that Guardian Arkveld has laid an egg, which has hatched, and left the nest. I am generously suggesting that Arkveld laid and hatched that egg in between 1 and 2 years, and the chick matured enough to leave the nest and survive to adulthood after Guardian Arkveld died. which is seems to be the case because we don't encounter any non-guardian Arkveld or any sign of non-guardian Arkveld until long after the main story. We find out this like empty nest is there and that the egg is hatched, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the guardian Arkveld has just hatched. It means it's matured enough to leave for the nest and fend for itself. It's particularly interesting, mainly because of the correlation between egg size and gestation period. So the bigger an egg gets, the longer it takes for the egg to actually grow and develop to an adult. A small-bodied reptile is going to be able to incubate an egg to maturity or incubate an egg to hatching very, very quickly compared to a large-bodied reptile. And so Arkveld, being exceptionally large-bodied compared to our modern reptiles and being somewhat reptilian in its physiology in the sense that it lays eggs, is going to probably have a relatively long time from laying to hatching. Now, this is interesting, especially in conjunction with the fact that birds with very large final body sizes also tend to grow relatively slow. However, there is something of note that I want to discuss here in the way that bird body size interacts with growth rate. So here we have two growth charts from two different species of birds. We have a relatively small bird, a white-crowned sparrow, on the top, and on the bottom we have a frigate bird, which is substantially larger. And what you can see here is this graph on the bottom is representing how the growth rate is kind of skewed towards the early life of the frigate bird compared to the sparrow. The sparrow is hitting its peak growth rate about halfway towards its maximum size, whereas the frigate bird, being substantially larger, has this huge spike of growth in very, very early. Which, despite the fact that birds are reptiles and descend from animals that presumably had a very, very typical kind of slow reptilian growth rate and spent much of their lives at a subadult age, birds have adapted a very, very unique reproductive strategy somewhere along their evolution, which matches what we were thinking about with the mammals rather than looking like this crocodile growth chart. And so if Arkveld is bird-like in its physiology, it's possible that it could lay eggs and then also grow relatively quickly upon hatching. So this doesn't really necessarily point us in any specific direction, which is unfortunate. So we do need to do a little bit of digging in regards to whether or not Arkveld is a fast grower, but we do know that the big egg does not preclude quick growth. So we're sitting at kind of a middle ground here. Big animals do tend to grow slower, and in the case of very, very big animals with very big eggs, the incubation process is also slower. However, then again, when we're looking at these big birds, it might have a burst of growth very early in its life that is not a really good reason to develop that armor. Another interesting point here is that precocial birds grow slower than altricial birds. So precocial birds are, well, when anything is precocial, it can move around and function immediately after birth. So a precocial bird would be something like an ostrich. Ostriches, they hatch and they're pretty good to go right out of the egg, whereas something like a parrot is going to need a very, very long period of parental care. If Arkveld was altricial like a parrot rather than precocial like an ostrich, and it needed extended periods of parental care, Arkveld would grow faster in its early life. Altricial birds tend to kind of optimize their growth rate to be very, very fast very early on, so they grow quickly and develop very, very quickly as well. And so if Arkveld is using this altricial growth strategy, then it's possible that we have a reason for it to be growing super quickly. Surprisingly, the reason why Arkveld might be altricial is actually found in its feet. When I was discussing Seregios, I kind of mentioned the reasoning behind developing bizarre foot arrangements and also the kind of clue that they give us into the kind of development that these animals have. In birds, that splitting of the toes, you can see on the bottom, anisodactyly is the default condition of birds. All of these guys, particularly zygodactyl and heterodactyl foot arrangements, require extended periods of development and are only found in birds that are altricial. And that's because When these birds are born, they have the default position of their toes, but their feet are soft and underdeveloped and very flexible. So the muscles instinctively kind of pull on the toes and rearrange them as the birds are developing, which is very, very interesting. And if this indeed does happen in Monster Hunter, which it might, because Arkveld and Seregios certainly don't have the default arrangement of toes compared to stuff like Rathalos and Tigrex and Nargacuga and all those guys. It is possible that early in its development, those two animals are rearranging their toes in this way. And because of the cost and basically the prerequisites for developing a zygodactyl foot arrangement, it is associated with a prolonged period of parental care. So now we know what the kind of prerequisite for evolving zygodactyly is, this kind of X-shaped foot arrangement that you see in things like owls and parrots, where this second toe, actually that's the fourth toe, is rotated to the back, and it's opposed just like the first toe, which is this one. So what the heck is the point of that, really? Why are these animals rearranging their toes in this way? What advantage does it confer? What possible reason could they have ecologically for doing this? And what does that say about Arkveld? So again, we have another apparent middle ground, this time not in growth rate, but in ecology. Versatility is very, very important. In Arkveld, versatility is going to be kind of a theme throughout its anatomy and development. It's a very, very adaptive animal, and that is probably the reason why it survived extinction and then didn't at the hands of humans, most likely. But the fact that it has maintained itself for this long, even if it did eventually go extinct, is pretty cool. So when we look at which animals, particularly which birds, have zygodactyl feet, we see that these zygodactyl foot shapes are correlated with a kind of mixture of either grasping and territorial activity, or in very, very rare cases, kind of weakly arboreal birds. The zygodactyl behavior, or the zygodactyl foot arrangement, is found in these Australian birds here, in birds that do a little bit of grabbing and a little bit of terrestriality. And so we see the same thing in Arkveld. So Arkveld's feet, despite the fact that we do sometimes see zygodactyly in general as kind of terrestrial and also grabbing animals, are really, really weird. These are not the kind of feet that you would expect to see in a more terrestrial zygodactyl animal like Arkveld. Arkveld doesn't spend a lot of time swinging from trees, and it doesn't seem to spend a lot of time grabbing prey and pulling it into the air. So why do its feet look like this? It has huge recurved claws here. These are massive, and they're very, very sharp and large, which is not something that we usually see on animals that are walking with those feet all four toes on the ground. Maybe they'll have a big raised claw that doesn't touch the ground, but that seems kind of counterintuitive. Additionally, again, it is zygodactyl, which is not something you usually see in animals that are only terrestrial. Arkveld, again, is not doing any climbing, so why the heck would it have these very, very bizarre feet? We can look here and compare these with some bird feet and look at terrestrial birds of prey compared to birds of prey that are hunting from the air and perching on branches. So here we have two very, very lovely bird feet. On the left is a secretary bird, Sagittarius serpentarius, which is a great Latin name. And these two birds are both in the order Accipitriformes. So they're both birds of prey. And they're both very, very effective predators. However, they hunt in very different ways. The secretary bird spends most of its time on the ground. It does fly, but it hunts primarily by kicking snakes to death, among other things. And so it is using its feet in predation. These claws are not small because it doesn't have a reason to have big claws on its feet. It is primarily killing stuff with its feet, which is really, really cool. It also looks the most bizarre out of any bird of prey I've ever seen. It's so, so cool. It's got these great big long legs. Its feet are still its primary weapon. If we look at the right, you have a harpy eagle. This is an animal that's also killing things with its feet. And the thing is, the harpy eagle is a perching animal that's primarily killing from the air, and it grabs primates and other small mammals usually, and it carries them off. Now, these claws are structured very similarly, but their size and their shape is quite different. The secretary bird has relatively small, not so curved claws, and the harpy eagle has these gigantic recurved claws that look a lot more like the ones on the feet of Arkveld. So if Arkveld is primarily a terrestrial animal that's not, snatching prey off the ground or climbing around in trees or on mountains or anything like that, then why does it have these giant recurved claws on its feet? So while different foot shapes might be more optimized for certain lifestyles over others, evolution does not necessarily always produce optimal forms. It's not survival of the fittest, really. It's survival of the good enough. If you can make the cut, you can survive, as long as you're not competing directly with anybody who's very similar to you. Arkveld might not have had a reason to keep this current morphology of its feet in its current environment, but if it's not causing it major harm and preventing it from doing anything, I wouldn't see a reason for it to lose it. Now, maybe its claws will shorten over successive generations, or maybe they won't, but we do see something very, very similar today with this bird on the right. This is a kakapo. It's not a flying bird, it's basically completely a ground-dwelling animal, and yet it has zygodactyl feet just like those of Arkveld, presumably because it descended, not presumably, in the case of Arkveld presumably, but in the case of the kakapo definitely because it descended from arboreal ancestors that lived in trees. Maybe Arkveld did the same thing too? We'll see. More discussion about that will come. So that's enough about feet. Let's get back to talking about the armor. I apologize for the side tangent, but the whole point of that discussion was kind of to show how we're getting a little bit of mixed signals related to Arkveld's growth. I didn't necessarily expect to work out its entire life history in the video, but it's giving me a few more questions than answers, personally. So when we're talking about Arkveld's armor, we can't assume that it being a slow grower and needing protection for most of its juvenile life is a good reason or the only reason to develop armor. That might be the case, but we can't say for sure. So let's see if we can find some other reasons why an animal of this size, of this niche, might develop this armor. The armor is very, very, very extensive. It's covering almost its entire body, particularly the dorsal surface, which is something that we see quite frequently. Armor tends to be concentrated on the dorsal surface, which is the back and the shoulders and the top of the head, all that type of area. That's all your dorsal surface. If you're a human, the behind you is your dorsal surface, which is interesting. And the most protected area on Arkveld is its face and back, whereas the armor on the rest of its body is quite flexible. One purpose that the armor and horns of Arkveld might serve is advantage piece in intraspecific combat. So Arkveld, if it doesn't have to worry about protecting itself from predators with its armor, could certainly have to worry about protecting itself from other Arkvelds over territorial or sexual disputes. In mammals, this is extraordinarily common. Horns and antlers and other structures have evolved several times. Particularly in hoofed animals, they've evolved in conjunction with a transition from kind of dense forest habitats to more open ones. When food is very dense and very plentiful, it seems like becoming an active defender of your territory becomes much more worthwhile, as opposed to when food is sparse, it's not really worth it to defend a much larger territory, which you would need to sustain yourself. Because these specialized weapons often evolve for territorial defense, it seems that in the case of Arkveld, if we're looking at its horns, there is a reason why Arkveld might have to protect itself against other members of its own species, and developing armor on most of its body would definitely help with that. But here's the thing. Every Arkveld we see has the same ornamentation on its head. They all have the same horns. If these animals are doing the typically assumed thing of males jousting with each other, why would all of them have the horns? Well, this is obviously not the only purpose of horns or cranial ornamentation. It's not just for males fighting each other. Horns in general, singular, are very good at securing feeding sites from other group members. And this can be females competing with other females, or it can be females competing with males, or males competing with females. They're always pretty useful. Animals aren't always trying to mate all the time, so not everything revolves around sexual competition with them, even in species that do engage in sexual competition. There is also really substantial evidence that females surprisingly compete amongst each other. This is an issue, and it has been for a while. A lot of people view natural science through a very, very patriarchal lens. And so this leads to more extensive study and kind of an overcharacterization of males of some species. And behaviors that are associated with both sexes just get associated with males. So if you look at reindeer, for example, both the males and the females compete with each other. And the horns are used useful, or the antlers rather, are useful in both sexes for that. We'll get to more of this later, but oh my gosh. Side note that very much plays into this thing, we've known for a while that snakes have two-headed penises. I don't know if I can say penis on YouTube. Well, I just said it. Anyway, we just found out recently that female snakes also have two-headed genitals. It took much, much longer to figure out because no one ever really thought to check. And this is just kind of a function of passive ideas that people come into science with, and they never end up questioning them, and it shapes the way that their research is done. So unique perspectives are very important. Anyway, that being said, the possession of large horns in animals like Arkveld, or like in reindeer or cows, can confer a sense of dominance over the other members of the group, not just of one sex, but of all your contemporaries. And for Arkveld, that intimidation is actually explicitly spoken about in the descriptions of its horns. We can take that as potentially an interpretation of the behavior of other Arkveld, or just other monsters in general, but we know that they have an intimidation function because of the item description. And the having horns of that size in all the individuals may mean that Arkveld are kind of constantly butting heads and scrapping with each other over territory. Weapons in both sexes are far from a unique thing. They're everywhere. Whether or not Arkveld actually has both sexes, though, is another question. So here I have a slide that says we know both sexes maintain territories, but in reality this should just say we know that all individuals maintain territories, because, again, we don't actually know if Arkveld is an animal that has two sexes for reasons that we'll get into later. We do know that every single individual Arkveld, regardless of their size, as long as they're large enough to hunt, does these little crop circle type drawings on the ground every so often. It'll drag its chain blades in circles around its body. And this is very, very similar to behaviors in many, many animals that they'll use to communicate information about themselves to other animals in the area. And Arkveld seems to be communicating this information visually by drawing these circular patterns on the ground that not only inform other passing Arkvelds of its presence, but they're also probably going to learn about how big it is, because the wider that circle is, presumably the longer and more intimidating the chain blades of the resident Arkveld is going to be. Now, territorial marking like this doesn't always necessarily end in conflict. Sometimes the smaller individual will just say, well, I can't be here, and then they'll leave, and that's beneficial for both of them. So this isn't really an adaptation that's used for larger animals to shut smaller animals out of their territory. It's more so an adaptation that is mutually beneficial, because it helps those smaller animals stay away from territories where they'll likely be cannibalized, or at least brutally injured if they enter the territory of a much larger individual. So this isn't necessarily like a subjugatory behavior. It's more so just a communication one. We take all these traits together, the big horns, the territorial marking, it starts to paint a picture of Arkveld as a relatively scrappy, antagonistic animal that probably engages in some territorial conflict. At the very least, it has, displays associated with avoiding territorial conflict via intimidation, which means that there is a potential for territorial conflict to emerge. So having armor that prevents the animal from suffering long-term harm is actually quite important. This sort of behavior, this intraspecific combat, may have also contributed to the evolution of the armor of crocodilians. They're some of the largest predators in the world. They're oftentimes the biggest predator in their habitat, and yet they still have armor. Obviously, it does help that they grow slow, so it's very effective at the beginning of their life when they're trying not to get eaten by other stuff. But even adult crocodilians benefit from that armor because they love to bite the hell out of each other, especially their faces and their tails. And so in that territorial conflict, having armor that protects the rest of their body is very, very, very important. Here we've got a little table that I made going over the potential reasons for Arkveld to develop armor and skull ornamentation, all the very exaggerated kind of protective structures that it has all over its body. So on the left, we have the interspecific reasons. Arkveld may have needed protection from predators in the past, or it might have protection from predators now as it's young, when it wasn't the top dog on the block. Now it is, of course, probably one of the strongest animals in wilds. There's not really much that can tangle with an adult Arkveld for any good reason. And then it also might need protection from combative prey. Arkveld, when it hunts, tends to wrestle its prey to the ground and bring it fairly close to its body. It's not using ranged attacks like something like Ray Dow, for example. It's an animal that has to get up close to its prey, and in the world of Monster Hunter, that can be very, very dangerous a lot of the time. So having armored skin would probably also be beneficial for that. In terms of conspecific reasons, these are threats from the same species. Arkveld might be encouraged to develop armor due to protection from rivals, and intimidation, basically stay out of my way, stay out of my territory type of stuff. And, of course, protection from cannibalism. We can't write off the idea that Arkveld do actively hunt and eat each other. This is something that happens in a lot of animals. It's pretty much the default in nature, which is why it always kind of cracks me up when people talk about cannibalism in certain animals, like it's a big deal, like it's an exception. Like, oh, Majungasaurus is a dinosaur that is unique in that it cannibalizes its young. Isn't that so interesting and bizarre? Well, Majungasaurus is certainly a very interesting animal. It's got a face like kind of like a pug, and it has these weird short legs, and it looks like a meat-eating sausage. It's got a unicorn horn in the middle of its head. I think the fact that it engaged in a very, very common behavior among animals is maybe the least interesting thing about it. Regardless, so cannibalism, protection from cannibalism, is a pretty valid reason to develop armor. In terms of purely like sexual reasons, the display aspect of it can't be ignored. This has something to do with behaviors like stridulation, when animals like saw-scaled vipers or crickets rub plates of armor on each other. They'll create noises and they can be incorporated in displays. We can't rule out that this armor started out relatively simple and grew more complex through sexual selection. There's also the component of individual recognition. Very big, ostentatious structures on the body will help Arkvelds tell each other apart, which is important in a social animal. Status signaling is also another thing. Antlers in deer are a status signal. The more nutrients that a deer has access to, the larger the antlers will grow. Same thing with bright colors in birds. And so these traits are serving not only as functional traits. Deer are going to use their antlers to fight each other, but they're also serving as a status signal, because having the resources to grow the biggest horns is an advantage in and of itself. It's a display of all the resources that you have access to. And of course, lastly, protection from potential mates. If you want to get rid of a pesky potential mate that you don't really like, being able to give them a stab with big old horns if you're a female is especially important. So things like reindeer and potentially mountain goats will basically chase off irritating younger males that they don't necessarily want to mate with their antlers or with their horns. And that could also be a function in Arkveld. And keep in mind, these functions are all things that we would expect to see in all individuals. It's not really just something that we would expect to see in one sex. There would be a different set of reasons up here if that was the case. But of course, there is always one more reason to develop armor. There's actually some pretty solid evidence that the armor of some reptiles might be involved in the way that they move. Arkveld's armor, like the armor of crocodilians and lizards, does not exist in a vacuum. It doesn't just sit on top of the body. It's probably, worked into the tissues somehow. It's not just, glued on there. And in the case of things like alligators and crocodiles, their armor plates, their osteoderms, which are pictured on the right, they're beautiful and they're so heavily sculptured. They're amazing. But they're worked into the ligaments and tendons on the dorsal surface of the body, which then attach to the apaxial muscle, so the muscles on the top of the body. And what that results in is a wide and strong and robust anchor point that allows the animals to walk upright much easier and facilitates side-to-side undulation for swimming, which is very, very interesting to suggest that somehow, in a very weird and roundabout way, the armor of these animals, this heavy bone that is sitting on top of their body, is actually making them more agile. for Arkveld, increased agility is not a terrible explanation for why it's developed these plates on top of its body to attach muscle to. Because while Arkveld isn't necessarily super fast, if anything, it is exceptionally agile. Brings us to talk about the forelimbs and the tail of Arkveld, which are certainly its most flexible body parts, especially these whips that it has on its forelimbs. But the tail is not to be discounted. It's also covered in very large interlocking osteoderms in the exact same way. And in the case of the tail, they actually kind of spread out. It seems like the vertebrae don't actually articulate together, and instead these osteoderms are, extending and contracting. The tail actually gets longer and shorter in some of its attacks, which is really incredibly interesting. And the fact that this same sort of structure is observed in all the most flexible parts of its body, I think lends credence to the idea that these osteoderms might actually have a role in the way that Arkveld moves. Fortunately, our ability to dissect Arkveld is relatively limited. We can learn some cool and interesting stuff. For example, if you look at the upper back there, you can see the osteoderms, very similarly to some osteoderms in modern crocodilians, have kind of this pitted structure underneath the surface, which is interesting. But here, of course, the purpose of this image is to look at the tail. There are two major osteoderms here. There's this big ventral one that sits on the bottom. It's kind of like a big flat ventral scoot with a keel. And then on the top, you have this big, giant, kind of A-shaped osteoderm. It's very difficult, though, to tell if these are actually properly embedded in the tail muscle or if they're embedded in the tendons, because it's pretty hard to tell if that's the case in alligators too if you're just looking at this tail cut. I mean, you can kind of see there, but the actual polygons that Monster Hunter is giving us are not necessarily as good as the ability to hold a gator tail in your hand and figure out exactly what tissues are working their way into the osteoderms. That being said, we can still learn some interesting stuff about the tail anatomy from this dissection. However, I am still confident in saying that these osteoderms have some kind of muscular ability, because if you look at the arms, oh my gosh, these are absolutely crazy in how well they're worked into the muscle here. You can see there's actually these kind of strands of pulling action that's happening. These might be tendons connected to a central muscle, or they might be bundles of muscle themselves that are actually attaching to the osteoderms, then pulling them up or down along the course of the whip. Speaking of the whip, what the heck actually is this thing? It's never properly called anything other than a chain blade, which is a pretty good name, but what is a chain blade? No animal that's alive today has something that's called a chain blade. So figuring out what kind of structure this chain blade is actually derived from could help explain whether or not these osteoderms are muscular or what. The first thing I thought when I was looking at Arkveld's chain blades was that they might actually be specialized feathers. There's a bird called the club-winged manakin that has these gigantic club-like feathers on its wings, as you might imagine. They aren't weapons by any means, but they are, large, blunt feathers that, if specialized sufficiently, could enhance the ability of wing slapping in a fictional animal like Arkveld. Feathers can be very robust and very strong, and so the possibility that Arkveld's wing whips are long, flexible feathers with very large barbs that interlock on them is interesting. And that's really what I thought of at first, because when I saw the way that the big, kind of rocky blades on the ends of Arkveld's feathers came together and interlocked, I was immediately reminded of the way that the barbs of feathers do that. However, I don't necessarily think this is the case. I was made to consider the fact that they might be Arkveld's other fingers. And this initially seemed like kind of an unappealing idea for me because the fingers are very flexible. Clearly, it's like they have no bones in them. They're whipping around, and that's just not feasible with the normal amount of joints you have in a finger. However, it seems more likely when you consider the fact that fingers do not necessarily have a standard number of joints, as you can see by the examples labeled D and E on the right of the slide. These are two tetrapods. They're four-limbed. Presumably they were land vertebrates at some point. They are a whale and an ichthyosaur. These are both animals that left the land to go into the water. And they have a condition called hyperphalangy, which, when I say condition, I don't mean like a disorder. I mean an evolutionary condition, in the same way that our evolutionary condition is that we have 5 fingers on each hand. So these guys have an absurd number of distal phalanges in their fingers, because for them, it's all about surface area. They want to make their fingers longer and more flexible so they can be more effective paddles. However, with Arkveld, that's probably not the case, and it's making its fingers longer and more flexible for whatever other reason, if that's the case. But these hyperphalangous fingers are certainly more flexible and more whip-like than what you would expect from a long finger in an animal like Arkveld. And if it does have this absurd number of finger bones, then its fingers might actually be able to function like whips in the way that we're seeing them do so in the game. Why would Arkveld evolve hyperphalangy if it was not a swimming animal? In real life, we only ever find this morphology in swimming animals. There's really no terrestrial examples of animals that have loads and loads of finger joints and a very long, floppy, flexible hand, except for animals that have come from the sea and started moving around on land. However, in the case of Arkveld, I think there might be kind of an interesting use for it, and it's basically it has to do with the kind of climbing behavior that I briefly mentioned earlier. The most interesting trends I've noticed with Arkveld's morphology as I've looked at it and kind of looked at modern animal correlates for what Arkveld looks like and does is that a lot of its anatomy points toward it being an arboreal animal. What's very interesting about evolution, again, is this whole survival of the good enough thing, where animals don't just carry morphology that is suited for their current lifestyle, but they carry these traces of previous populations that they evolved from. Humans still have a ton of the ingredients in our bodies for building gills, if that makes sense. Like all of our neck muscles, all of our arms, and they're all mapped on very, very clearly to the parts of fish, because humans are fish. We're very highly advanced, very highly derived terrestrial fish, but we are fish nonetheless. And even though we're doing different things with our fishy limbs and our fishy mouths, we still have those fish traits that we carry with us. And in the same way, the fact that Arkveld now uses its whips as weapons does not preclude the fact that they might have originated as a tool for tree climbing or some other kind of climbing. And I'm going to go over some of these points now and hopefully try to explain my idea for a second. So a major point here is that Arkveld is very, very flexible, more so than almost any wyvern in the game. In this illustration that I've done of Arkveld doing its backflip attack, you can see that it's basically capable of biting the tip of its own tail, which is just not something that you see very much in any of these flying wyverns. In general, they tend to have relatively stiff tails, especially the bipedal ones, because stiff long tails help you balance, and that kind of floppy dragging tail is not going to be very, very beneficial to a flighted animal. If you're having to constantly use muscle to hold your tail up off the ground rather than drag it behind you when you're walking around, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually fly properly. Whereas if you're a tree climber and you're not doing a ton of flying, having a floppy muscular tail that you can tighten up to wrap around a branch or something of that sort, or maybe a rock or something like that to grab on, is going to be much more beneficial. So in general, we see this tail being super flexible, but also the body itself just curves around very, very insanely. Like Rathalos could not pull this pose where it's basically looking at its own butt. And this is true for many of the monsters. And so this kind of flexibility is something that we see very, very frequently in climbing animals. Again, I briefly mentioned the tail, and so we're going to take a little bit more of a intense look at the actual anatomy of Arkveld's tail and compare it with some climbing animals that we see today, and particularly talk about the tail muscles. To orient ourselves, we're looking at the back side of one of Arkveld's tail vertebrae. This round part in the middle is called the centrum. That's where this vertebra is going to attach to the next one. Atop the centrum, that's where the spinal cord is going to run through. And then you have these two transverse processes on the side, along with this hemal spine on the bottom and this neural spine on top. So underneath the transverse processes, which are these side-pointing ridges, the bottom half of the muscle, This is called the hypaxial muscle. Arkveld only seems to have one hypaxial muscle, this part of its tail. Keep in mind, not all the tail vertebrae have the same muscle attachments, so it's actually quite difficult to tell what the whole tail musculature looks like just from this one cross section, but we're playing with what we have. So this hypaxial muscle is, in this case, probably the caudofemoralis. It's the longest of and largest of the tail muscles. And in this case, it's quite large. It's the biggest muscle in this tail, as it is typically in most reptiles. And here it is very, very big, very expanded underneath the tail. And then compared to the epaxial muscles, there's a few of them. You have this one here, which is the longissimus caudae, and then the transversospinalis muscles up here. And these are going to function to pull the tail to the side and then pull it up. The caudofemoralis is going to pull the tail to the side and pull it down. So when both of these caudofemoralis muscles are flexed, the tail is going to curl under. Now, if we take a look at our chameleon, we can compare the general shape of the tails. And just like the chameleon, Arkveld's tail is substantially wider at the bottom. However, that's not necessarily due to the muscles or the shape of the tissue. Interestingly, the chameleon has these kind of downward pointing transverse processes on its tail, which are giving it this kind of downturned shape. In general, though, the tail of Arkveld is, fairly vertically compressed. It's kind of squat. And it still does have very large bundles of hypaxial muscle that are going to curl the tail in. And while Arkveld's tail doesn't necessarily have more muscle at the bottom, it does have this very wide shape at the bottom, which is going to provide lots of surface area for grip, and those spines and hair are going to create friction and grab into whatever substrate Arkveld is trying to grip onto. So another really interesting thing here is that it's not just the shape of chameleons' tails that are correlated with their arboreality, but when we actually compare across chameleon species and look at which ones are more ground-based and which ones spend more time climbing and presumably utilizing their tails for grabbing, the arboreal chameleons have much longer and more flexible tails. So Arkveld having a comparatively longer and more flexible tail than the other wyverns, again, does stand in favor of it using that tail in arboreal climbing, or at least in some kind of climbing. Because there are a lot of things in the Monster Hunter universe that vaguely look like trees and are not necessarily trees, so I'm not ruling out the possibility that Arkveld goes climbing other places, but it's certainly not adapted to inhabit areas like the Windward Plains or the Ice Shard Cliffs. Well, maybe the Ice Shard Cliffs. The Windward Plains in particular is just does not seem to be a very suitable habitat for it, and yet it seems to be doing fine, which is pretty bizarre. Here we can again compare the insane degree of both length and flexibility that Arkveld has out of its tail. Again, the tail can extend and contract, which is really, really cool, and it's not something we've seen, to my knowledge, in any other wyvern in Monster Hunter, that the tail vertebrae are not fixed together. They can actually spread apart, if there are indeed any vertebrae at all towards the distal end of the tail, which is just really interesting to think about. Seregios, which is a very, very agile animal, and has a relatively flexible tail, still does not get anywhere near the range of motion that Arkveld does with its tail, with the incredible whipping action that goes on there. So I do think it's very, very interesting how much of an emphasis they're putting on Arkveld's flexibility when it doesn't seem to be doing much with it in the game besides fighting, because this kind of structure very rarely evolves solely for combat. It's almost always a co-option or an exaptation of some other structure that is existing, and it gets used for another purpose. Another really cool, interesting adaptation that a lot of arboreal animals have is that not just the hind limbs are adapted for grasping, but the forelimbs as well. This is possible even in flying animals, which also have a whole other set of functions that their forelimbs are specialized for beyond just walking. So this is an image of an animal called Cunpangopterus antipolicatus, which is a pterosaur, so a flying reptile from the age of the dinosaurs, though it was not a dinosaur itself, with an opposable thumb, which is a trait that we only really see in things that do a lot of grabbing. So here, the Cunpangopterus is hypothesized to be using it for two reasons. One, it's grabbing that branch, and the other one is object manipulation. It's grabbing a little bug. Which is really, really cool. And so Arkveld's wing arms, or rather I guess they are wing arms because they're arms and wings. Arkveld's forelimbs might be so flexible and so sinewy and bizarre like that, so they can wrap themselves around branches in order to help it climb better. Certainly know that Arkveld's forelimbs are very, very good at grabbing, because when Arkveld wants to grab you, it doesn't use its, claw hands. It uses its big chain whips, and it wraps them around you. So the fact that Arkveld can very, very quickly and very easily sling those whips around an object that is relatively small, like the hunter, and hold on to it with significant force, suggests to me that these are structures which are, at the very least, quite capable of grabbing and would be very, very useful for extending the reach of the arm during climbing behavior. Maybe Arkveld isn't necessarily a tree-dwelling animal, but if it's clambering up the side of a mountain, or it's in another environment that would be very, very important for it to be a specialized climber, then these long chain whips would certainly be very, very helpful for that. Here on the hind limbs, we also see a really big similarity with ancestrally arboreal animals. Remember that I mentioned earlier that we do have some terrestrial zygodactyl birds, like this guy, the kakapo. The kakapo, though, is, like I mentioned again, a descendant of a arboreal ancestor, right? It used to have, an arboreal lifestyle before it transitioned to the ground. It's a parrot, and so parrots tend to be climbing animals, and they have these very specialized feet for grabbing and climbing. And again, these feet are not terrible on the ground, but this zygodactyl foot morphology is very, very good for climbing, and climbers have a good reason to evolve it. It's especially good at, wrapping around branches, of course, and also grabbing prey from the air if you're a climbing predator. Arkveld really does not have much of a reason to switch up its feet so dramatically on the ground, and so it's very likely to me that the zygodactyl feet are a retained trait from a lifestyle that Arkveld no longer leads in the modern day. The final interesting point on this, I think, is one of a little bit of a more of a phylogenetic approach, which is to say, if the closest relatives of Arkveld are also relatively arboreal or relatively, climbing-oriented animals, we should expect Arkveld to also be quite similar to them, and probably also share a bit of their lifestyle and live a similar way if it's speciating from them. For example, if I found an animal today and it had feathered wings, but it looked, generally speaking, like a bat in terms of just the way that its body was laid out, I would say, well, this probably isn't a bat, even though it has kind of a bat-esque body plan. If it, maybe uses its wings to walk around and decides to hang upside down, even though those behaviors are very similar to a bat, even though, an average person might put it in the category of bat, if it has feathered wings, it's got to be a bird, because birds are the only extant animals with feathers. And so I would look to birds and I would say, well, this is certainly a very, very weird bird, but it's a bird nonetheless, and it's got to fit in here somewhere. And in looking at Arkveld, the same kind of thing emerges. Arkveld looks a lot like a typical flying wyvern in terms of the way that its body sits, but in reality, Arkveld is a lot more similar physiologically to a whole other group of animals. Arkveld, I think, has feathers. Those hair-like structures on its body are monofilamentary, or at least they kind of look like it. But in terms of the way that they're laid out, I really think it's quite compelling to say that they're feathers. Particularly feathers attached to the kind of backside of the wing. And I think that the kind of blades, of the chain blades, if this is what we're looking at here, this is the central shaft of the chain blade, and then you would have the big blade sticking out of the side. This is meant to be one large blade that's coming out of the side here. And the way that these attach to the chain blades, with all these little tiny muscles feeding in and out of them, and how they all lock together and then fan out when the chain blade is extended, that kind of movement is something that we really, really see a lot in bird feathers, especially with the spines being attached to the central shaft, which is a modified finger. And then when that modified finger bends in a certain way, all of the spikes act in unison. This is how feathers work, where there's tendons running along here that are attached to the feathers, such that when the underlying finger bone moves, all the feathers fan out. And then when the wing closes, these feathers are retracted back this way by the same muscles. And the fact that Arkveld's chain whips also do this when they're pulled together they all kind of automatically slide up, and all those little parts interlock together, I think is a very, very interesting homology between those feathers, especially the feathers kind of forming the membrane on the back of Arkveld's wing. When we look to find monsters that have feathers on their wings, and especially monsters that have wings where the feathers are attached to the last two digits, it's very, very hard to find large monster relatives that fit that bill. However, this whole collection of little bird guys from Monster Hunter World and Wilds is very, very strikingly similar to Arkveld in terms of the way that their wings are arranged. Most of these guys do have fewer than 3 exposed digits, but if you look at the woodland pteryx, they have 3 digits out here, and then on the very bottom where these feathers attach, there's this tiny little 4th vestigial looking digit that looks like it's the attachment point for all those wing feathers. And you can go to this website, monsterhunterevo.wordpress.com, to get some slightly better images of the woodland pteryx, because I really, really think that what we're seeing there is the attachment of these feathers to a 4th digit, which is our missing link, really, because if Arkveld has these highly modified blade-like feathers on its 4th and 5th digits, they would have to come from a feathered 4th or 5th digit at some point, right? So we're looking for animals that have their first 3 digits free, and the 4th and 5th digits incorporated into the wing, with feathered wings that don't have any sort of membrane. And as a bonus, notice that all the animals here are relatively bird-like, and they spend a lot of time climbing and perching, which is exactly the kind of lifestyle that we would expect Arkveld to be specialized in, which I think is fantastic and interesting. So Arkveld's closest relatives might not be large flying wyverns at all. In fact, I think Arkveld's closest relatives might be sacrits. I mentioned earlier that woodland pteryxes have kind of vestigial 4th fingers, but sacrits have feathers on these last 2 fingers, if you look here, and they have these other 3 fingers retained. Sacrits are also biogeographically very, very close to where we would expect Arkveld to be, at least. They're still in the Eastlands, and they have, a very, very similar sort of very bizarre series of traits that suggest that they are coming from a trees down lifestyle. It looks like sacrits have transitioned from living arboreally to living terrestrially, which is so interesting because we see the exact same pattern of morphology within Arkveld, where it's bringing a bunch of these historically arboreal traits down onto the ground, perhaps in different ways, but their body construction is overall very, very similar, which is incredibly shocking. And this is not the direction that I expected this to go at all. But the fact that Arkveld and the sacrits are so bizarrely anatomically similar in the way that their wings are constructed, I think is so fascinating. Thematically for the game, the fact that your greatest companion is maybe the closest relative of the animal that you're hunting down for most of the story. I think the fact that Arkveld isn't just another big meat-eating flying wyvern makes its extinction so much more tragic. It's not, just another Rathalos, and not to say that it would not be tragic if we lost a species of Rathalos, but the fact that Arkveld is so heavily derived and so clearly evolutionarily distant from all the other wyverns in the game, this really is an animal that is belonging to an ancient lineage. It is the last record of this kind of animal that it is. We don't see any other big predatory guys who are related to these little bird-like endemic creatures or the sacred. We really just don't see them anywhere. There's nothing anywhere in Monster Hunter that is remotely like Arkveld, which is so fascinating and also so very tragic. The fact that we have kind of a facsimile of Arkveld around today doesn't do much to mitigate the tragedy of loss that was what happened to that original guardian, or not guardian population, that original wild population of Arkveld that was almost certainly driven to extinction either through inaction or through direct action of the Wyverians. They had the ability to conserve it, clearly, because they would have had to capture it to make guardian copies of it. And so if they would have put their effort into conserving this original species rather than cloning it and setting it loose upon the world, maybe we could still have a thriving original endemic Arkveld population today. But functionally, it is simply impossible to actually make a species come back from extinction, Because when you do quote unquote de-extinction, you can't bring back the context of a species. I try to not use very personifying language when I talk about animals. I try not to use words like purpose or design or things like that, because it implies that nature puts a purpose in everything. But I can't think of a better way to use it than to say, an animal does not have a purpose if it just exists in a vacuum. It needs to serve its ecosystem, because that's what everything is. Everything is all interconnected. When you resurrect an animal from the dead, you can't de-extinct its microbiome. You can't de-extinct its behavior. There's so many components to making a de-extinct animal actually serve its ecosystem, serve itself, and thrive in the world that you simply cannot do. So while Arkveld might be back from extinction aesthetically, the fact is Arkveld never actually returned from the grave. Arkveld went extinct when the Wyverians decided that making a guardian was a sufficient way to conserve this species, if they even cared about that sort of thing. To really drive home this point, I want to talk about an ecosystem that functionally does not really exist today. The mammoth steppe used to be a very, very widespread type of ecosystem that was almost entirely dependent on the grazing of mammoths. Mammoths, of course, are a kind of elephant that went extinct very, very recently. And when they did go extinct, we lost the largest grazing animals in most of the world. Mammoths would dig through the snow with their tusks to uproot plants, and in the process they would churn the dirt and dissipate more nutrients than, they're basically living plows. And so they were able to sustain these incredibly biodiverse and incredibly unique ecosystems that really depended on the mammoths and their community to create this sort of thing. But, without all of the species from the mammoth steppe being returned simultaneously and all their behaviors magically being replicated, you wouldn't be able to resurrect a Pleistocene ecosystem. It would simply just not exist in the same way. You could have a facsimile of it, but I don't think you could really understand what it was like through de-extinction, because to be able to actually recreate the ecosystem, you would have to know almost every little tiny detail about it, which is kind of sad. So while it is a little bit depressing to acknowledge, I think it is important to really understand the fact that in at least some capacities, when a species is gone, it is really gone. No matter if you have something that's running around today that looks kind of like it, it is gone forever. No matter how much a Seriema looks like a Forus rachis, no matter if that Seriema gets really big and occupies that niche again, it's not going to be a Forus rachis. There are many animals today that have adapted convergently to look like their ancestral forms, but again, it's kind of this facsimile of de-extinction. Sometimes animals do just vanish into deep time, never to be seen again, and that is the case with Arkveld. This is getting really depressing, but I think it is really important to talk about the real tangible impact and the amount of impact that extinction has because of this. This is why conservation is so important, because no matter what John Hammond says, or actually I think it was Nigel Marven who said extinction doesn't have to be forever. When you don't have a time machine, unfortunately it is. Especially because the other species that shaped Arkveld's ecosystem are probably also extinct. Maybe Arkveld lived in ancient forests that now sit where the windward plains are and it has nowhere to climb. Maybe it was living in coastal woodlands or coastal cliffs that are now completely underwater and are completely uninhabitable to it. Maybe they relied on large elder dragons churning the ground to create nutrients for its preferred species to feed on. And because those elder dragons have either dissipated or become less populous or gone extinct, the ecosystems that they create are gone now. It seems right now that Arkveld is literally a homeless species that has no endemic population. Arkveld only currently exists as an induced species, an introduced species. it is the product of an escaped clone, so it's technically even a feral population of a domesticated animal that is now kind of set upon the world. But it's also the only population of that animal that exists, and it's the product of an ancient and incredibly unique lineage. So there is this real dilemma here. Is it worth conserving Arkveld? Should we actually expedite its extinction? Should we try to make Arkveld go extinct so it has no impact on an ecosystem that it's not native to? Should we just let nature take its course? Should we not intervene at all? Or should we try to keep it around? Should we do our best to protect Arkveld from going extinct as a result of its competitors in an ecosystem that it's just been introduced to, simply because it exists as a fantastic record of natural history? You know, it might not be exactly the same as that ancient extinct Arkveld, but we can learn so much today about ancient sphenodonts from looking at a tuatara. Tuataras are not all ancient sphenodonts alive today, right? But they are a species. They're the last living species of sphenodont, a lineage that split from all the other reptiles millions and millions and millions of years ago. And if the tuataras went extinct, even though we would only be losing one species, if tuataras went extinct before we could study them, we would know barely anything about these guys. The fact that we have a living analog for such an ancient population is so important for research. So don't let the fact that Arkveld is only one more species that would go extinct make you think that that is necessarily the best option. But at the same time, Arkveld is kind of behaving like a feral cat. How many species are going to go extinct because they have small populations and they're not adapted at all to predation from something like Arkveld? This is a very real situation. Imagine if, for a moment, the Burmese pythons that we mentioned earlier, imagine if they went completely extinct in their native range where they're currently vulnerable. They're threatened animals. It's not impossible that Burmese pythons go completely extinct where they live natively. And that would leave the only existing populations of Burmese pythons in the Florida Everglades, where they are immensely ecologically harmful. These guys put an incredible amount of ecological pressure on local species. They eat alligators. They eat a lot of endangered local species. And so currently they're being removed quite actively. There's a lot of people trying to, euthanize all the Burmese pythons they can find for relatively good reason. Because, for every Burmese python that you euthanize, that's a couple native animals that actually are, endemic to that ecosystem that are going to survive. But at the same time, when that's the only population of this animal, should we conserve it? If the Burmese python's native population went extinct, it would be a real dilemma of, do we keep this record around? In the case of the Burmese python, it might actually be more clear-cut than Arkveld, because Burmese pythons do exist pretty readily in captivity and in zoos. So removing them from this ecosystem probably would be less impactful than removing them entirely. But if this was the only way to have Burmese pythons around, I think there would be a pretty solid debate about it. If an animal that is the last of its kind is causing a significant amount of ecological damage, maybe they could be kept around until they're safely returned to their original habitat. But what if that original habitat is gone or completely unsuitable? It's a really, really difficult discussion to have, but it is an important one because a lot of these issues are about to face conservation today. These are serious topics and they require serious amounts of discussion. And I hope I'm not boring anybody by using Monster Hunter as a jumping off point for this, but part of what I like so much about Monster Hunter is its emphasis on conservation, its emphasis on caring about the environment that you occupy and on viewing humans as parts of the ecosystems that they live in, as real ecological stewards, because that's what we are. We are animals. We do care about the world that we live in, and we have a role in it. Inaction is a choice. It's not, the default state. It's not automatically morally right to step away from ecological change. It's very important to consider what your role in it should be. And that's something that's really, really important to think about. Sometimes intervention is the right call. I think Monster Hunter does a really, really good job of showing that. Sometimes you do need to get your hands dirty for the betterment of not just yourself and the people around you, but the world that you live in. Sometimes you have to cull Burmese pythons to protect native wildlife. So enough with all that talk about extinction and its permanence and whatever. I did want to end this video on kind of a high note for a couple reasons, mainly just because I think that's a better way to end videos. let's talk about Arkveld's reproduction, which I think is really interesting and really fantastic, and is kind of a light in the darkness for its future. Arkveld survived literally the most dire situation that a species could be in. For an extended period of time, there was only one Arkveld, and yet now there is a population established, and it did this through a mechanism called parthenogenesis. This is a real adaptation that occurs in some species that exist today. And it's the ability for females to self-fertilize and reproduce asexually. Sometimes this is obligate, which means that the species has to do, and sometimes it's facultative, which means that it only happens when the species needs it to happen. Now, it's very difficult to say whether Arkveld is an obligate or facultative parthenogenetic species. This is mainly down to the fact that we can't sequence Arkveld's genes and find out whether or not its females are homo or heterogametic. What that means basically is that in some species, females are the ones that have multiple different kinds of chromosomes, and the males only have one. So in the case of those species, parthenogenetic females can clone themselves to produce either male or female offspring to recover a breeding population. However, in some species, like mourning geckos, for example, females can really only produce fertile females. They can't produce fertile males. There are some male mourning geckos, but they're all infertile. And so because of that, mourning geckos likely will never re-evolve proper sexual reproduction, and they will continue to be asexual in an obligate manner. Whereas something like a California condor, which is a bird that has a very the bird chromosome system where males are ZZ and humans and females are ZW, as opposed to humans where males are XY and humans are XX. Oh my gosh, and females are XX. A parthenogenetic human female would only be able to produce female offspring, whereas a California condor, which is a bird, can produce both male and female offspring. We don't know which of these systems, if either, Arkveld uses. It could be like a platypus and have like 10 billion different sex chromosomes. Who knows? However, one thing that is really interesting is that there do appear to be facultatively parthenogenetic monsters in Monster Hunter. Nergigante is stated to reproduce asexually, just like a mourning gecko does. So this is definitely something that the developers are aware of and could have had in mind when they were creating Arkveld. Kind of mentioned earlier, parthenogenesis absolutely does occur in real animals, and there are a few species that are obligate parthenogenetic species. Here are a couple of lovely lesbian lizards just in time for Pride Month. On the left, we have a mourning gecko, which is a kind of scaly-toed gecko that reproduces exclusively asexually. And on the right, there's a species of whiptail lizard. I forget the exact name of the species of the whiptail lizard, but it's a kind of whiptail lizard that's very interesting. I know the Latin name. I wrote it down, but these guys are obligate clonal reproducers, which is awesome. And it is a very, very effective reproductive strategy. And the ways that they skirt the downsides of this reproductive strategy are fantastic and very interesting. But I think the most interesting part about this is that these lizards, even though they reproduce without exchanging genetic information with a partner, still mate. They still copulate, or as the researchers call it, pseudocopulation. But they go at it, and they have distinct sexual behaviors that they pair with each other, where two females will pair with each other and take on different roles, and then they will both self-fertilize after that due to the resultant hormones, which is really, really interesting. And I think about this, it is Pride Month. As a queer person, I've been asked a couple times, the common homophobic retort of, what would happen if you put a bunch of gay people on an island? They would never successfully reproduce and start a functioning society. Which, one, it's not true, because not all gay people are gay men, as is often presumed to be the case for some reason by people who make that kind of statement, and also not all people who would be referred to as queer in that situation are exclusively attracted to men. Yada yada yada. Point is, in this case, turns out having a population that is exclusively homosexual is actually incredibly beneficial and makes you one of the most successful species of lizard in the world. Are Arkveld all lesbians? I promise I didn't have this in mind when I started scripting this video to release in early June, but it just so happened to be where this script went? Maybe. The answer is maybe. It really just depends on how their sex determination system works. Like I mentioned earlier, if the self-fertilized Arkvelds are incapable of producing male offspring, then yes, all the living Arkveld would be female. And I think the fact that we see so little differentiation in the population either means that Arkveld has zero sexual dimorphism that is visible from the outside, which is possible, or all the Arkveld we see are female, which I think is a pretty feasible option. We could just be seeing females of different sizes and ages. There's really not a way to definitively prove it, but I think it would be an interesting area of future research. Shout out Lesbian Arkveld. What is really interesting about this is the fact that Arkveld might not have originated as an all-female asexually reproducing population. The wild population of Arkveld might have had males and reproduced sexually. It's very, very possible that the ability of Arkveld females to clonally reproduce under certain circumstances, rather than reproduce sexually, could have just been a survival adaptation where, they can artificially increase population numbers and increase the chance of their offspring finding a mate, and pass on their genetic information without the need for a male in dire circumstances. And through the Wyverians putting them in dire circumstances by literally eliminating all of the males of the species in this hypothetical scenario, they forced that facultative parthenogenesis to become obligate parthenogenesis. And so when that last male died, it completely, switched the species mode of reproduction and created this new species of parthenogenetically reproducing Arkveld. Before we move on to this discussion of whiptail lizards and using them as an example for how parthenogenesis evolves, I wanted to mention again that the reason why I'm not saying definitely that I think Arkveld are, in the modern day, all parthenogenetically reproducing an all-female species is because I simply do not have the ability to tell by looking at Arkveld whether or not Arkveld are all female lesbians. There's simply no way for me to gather that data. Fortunately, I have invited into my home a lesbian, and she's going to say whether or not Arkveld are all female lesbians and they reproduce parthenogenetically exclusively, and hopefully this will forever settle the debate. Azalea, are Arkveld all lesbians?
Yes.
You heard it here first, folks. Anyway, so Aspidosolidids are a really, really unique group of lizards. They're called whiptail lizards, and they have these really cool plated legs, which is where they get their name. It means shield leg. But in particular, this one genus, Aspidosolidus uniparens, is a really, really unique example of parthenogenesis in that it is able to straddle the hurdle of losing genetic diversity through asexual reproduction. Mourning geckos are all pretty much genetically the same. The only way for them to increase genetic diversity is kind of through mutation. But Aspidosolidus uniparens is so freaking bizarre. It's actually a hybrid of these two species, Aspidosolidus inormatus and Aspidosolidus birdi, which then created this diploid parthenoform here, which is a hybrid that then again hybridized with inormatus, and that produced a triploid parthenoform uniparens. What that means is that the modern Aspidosolidus uniparens has 3 copies of each chromosome. And so rather than having each chromosome pair with its match, with its partner, the chromosomes can get shuffled around and increase genetic diversity without having to have sexual intercourse, without having to actually exchange genes with another individual. These guys can clonally reproduce themselves and still maintain genetic diversity within their population, which is insane. And if Arkveld is an animal that's doing this, there's no reason why it wouldn't be able to straddle that hurdle of extinction and create a genetically diverse population off of just a single individual like we see it do in the game. So that's really all I had to say about Arkveld today. Fortunately, my recording was interrupted by the announcement of Monster Hunter Wilds Ascendance, which is the DLC that's coming out whenever in 2027. And boy, do I have a lot to say about that. So this is just going to be, this last part is going to be a little bit of an unscripted rant in reaction to the DLC. First of all, I'm super excited about the new map. I think it's cool to have more verticality. I'm also very excited that the game is getting a new director. And I especially like how it's someone who's never directed a Monster Hunter game before. I'm really excited to see what a new kind of series of ideas can bring. And it's certainly not someone who's inexperienced. He's worked on some of the coolest Monster Hunter games in the series, like Portable Third. But one thing that is really fascinating to me is those kind of jet engine powered bird wyverns that are in the trailer. I think those guys are super fascinating. I really think siphon-based movement is something that's very underutilized with flying animals. I think it would be really, really cool to see, and I'm excited that they're doing that. It's very Volstrax-esque, but it feels more plausible. I also really like how they're doing, kind of social dynamics with them. There seems to be a big pack of them. I love what I got to see of the new Kashala Daora. Kashala Daora has been kind of a guilty pleasure of mine for ages because I really love the way it looks. But as someone who does not use ranged weapons very much, the fight in World was pretty annoying, and that has kind of just given me a bad taste of Kashala Daora. And as well in 4U, I kind of didn't really enjoy Kashala. I mean, it's not the worst fight that I've had, but I'm really excited to see what the Wilds devs do with it because I think it's going to be really cool. I'm a little bit disappointed we only saw one new monster in the trailer, and the rest were returners. But that's usually how the DLCs are. I'm excited to see returning monsters get higher poly models so I can say more about their anatomy. For those of you who've maybe been following the channel for a long time, you know that I've been on the back burner kind of planning on making a series of these videos about older games like Try. The issue with doing that, though, is that the models are a lot lower poly, and it's kind of hard to do these detailed anatomical drawings of stuff that doesn't really have, such a great base to draw from, and it's just a technological limitation. But that's the main reason why I kind of really haven't done a ton of videos on super old stuff. But now you can rest assured that I will be covering Lao Shen Lung in the future, which is crazy. I never imagined that they would add Lao Shen Lung to a 6th generation game. Like that's bonkers. And another really cool detail is Lao Shen Lung, when he's on the move, is typically running away from something. So I'm very, very interested in seeing exactly what Lao Shen Lung is running from in the new Monster Hunter Wilds DLC. I'm very, very much looking forward to that. Yeah, that's all really, really exciting. I like the look of the new weapon gimmick. I think that's cool. I'm always down for rockets. I can't think of what I would expect in that new biome ecologically. I really do think it's cool how Monster Hunter Wilds is, for the first time in the series, really starting to play into urban ecosystems, which is something that sounds a little bit like an oxymoron if you're not super familiar with it. But cities really are active ecosystems, and the way that they shape life is so interesting. And for a world as old as Monster Hunter, it's certainly possible that life has evolved to live and thrive in those floating city ecosystems. We really don't have a handle on what the time scale of the world is. For example, it's my pet theory that Jin Dahad evolved to be so big after the Wyverians figured out how to handle that whole gravity situation, because the main limiting factor for size for something like Jin Dahad would be gravity. And so by living in a low gravity environment, Jin Dahad would have no reason not to get so big, which is really, really cool. Anyway, I'm really, really quite excited for the DLC. I'll definitely be making content for it as it comes out. Probably not some detailed breakdowns until the actual DLC releases, but you can look forward to maybe some speculative content and stuff like that. Again, my schedule might be a little bit different because I'm about to move in less than a week, and I'm rushing this video out because I thought I was going to have all next week to record it because I messed up my calendar and I thought Summer Games Fest was next week, and I was like, oh, they're totally going to announce a DLC at Summer Games Fest, and I want to release this video right after. I did not expect them to have Summer Games Fest and release the announcement while I was recording this video, which is unfortunate and a bad bit of time management on my part, but I'm still getting this video out as quickly as I can, so it'll hopefully be up at the usual time. Moving is a little bit hectic, but things are going good. And a bit of housekeeping. Just a huge thank you to everyone who's helped make this channel what it is. I mean, I have 3,700 subscribers now, which is a lot. I have more subscribers than, if one person subscribed to me every year after the extinction of Mechasuchus kalpakasai, I would have fewer subscribers than I do now by about 1,000, which is really something. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. 3,700 people is more than I could ever wish for in the audience of a conference hall that I was giving a talk at. I would be ecstatic. And the fact that most of my videos get more views than I have subscribers is insane. I really don't. I think I express my appreciation enough for how many people sit and watch my content, because it means a lot to me that folks are enjoying my art in this way. Of course, also a thank you to Capcom, and to everyone who's worked on Monster Hunter for creating these beautiful animals for me to break down and dissect. And of course, to all the authors who are responsible for the real-world science papers that I cite on this channel, some of whom I know and have thanked in person. But those who I haven't, if you're seeing this, thank you very much. And of course, a great big happy Pride to every one of you. This video is coming out in early June, which is Pride Month, and I think it is really important to acknowledge, the experience of being queer, especially in the modern day. I think it can be really depressing and very disheartening to be a queer person in today's political climate. At least that's how I feel to a degree. But I do find community. I find lovely people who I can spend time with. And if you have that, I recommend you do it. And if you don't have that, then I'm sorry. And all I can say is that I know it will get better, and that you just kind of have to hold on. I had a time in my life where I really was the only person like me that I knew. And when I met the first time I met a queer scientist, I was quite young, but I met this person when I was in high school, and she was a PhD, and it was so cool to see that someone who was like me on such a personal, deep level. She didn't know anything about me, but she was open about it. She talked about it, and that meant so much to me. And that was really the first time where I felt the ability, where I was like, wow, yeah, I can commit to this, and whatever happens, but I can. There's a possibility that if I try and I try to do science, I will succeed. And it happened. I did it. I do science now. So if you are queer and you're in a position like that, do be proud of yourself, because I know it can be scary. I know it can be risky, but to be out is really not just to be true to yourself, but it's to show other people that they can be true to themselves, that they can be themselves, and they can go where they want without anyone telling them otherwise. That's what I think is something that's so important, is, to come out, to be proud, is to be a leader. That's really important. So yeah, happy Pride, everybody. Thank you for watching my videos. And here's to many more. I think this is wraps on what is it? I think is it year 1 or year 2 of Wilds? I think it's a little over the first year, but this is wraps on like the first development cycle of Wilds. I guess this is kind of the end of season 1 of this series. I do have a couple videos kicking around that I am going to upload, but yeah, thanks for everybody for sticking with this so far, and definitely here's to many more. I look forward to seeing you all in the future. Thank you very much. Those of you who are unaware, I do have all these prints available for purchase on my Redbubble account. Not saying that you got to go buy them, but a lot of people always ask me, oh, where can I see the full pieces of art that you do for the videos? These are all available on Redbubble. Yeah, that's really all I got to say at the end here. But I just wanted to have like kind of a scroll of some of these Arkveld pieces. Anyway, thanks so much, everybody. I hope you have a lovely night. Goodbye.